Welcome to Startup Exchange. We are a professional student-led organization based out of Georgia Tech, and our goal is to empower students at Georgia Tech and young entrepreneurs in the Atlanta community to make their dreams and ideas into a reality. Our organization offers a multitude of experiences, from our membership program to our weekly events, where you can explore the world of startups. Join the Startup Exchange community today. Connect with us on our various social media platforms, check out our website, and we'll see you at our next event.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Let me just share my screen really quick. All right, thanks for coming out again. My name is Jacob. So like that video said, we are Startup Exchange. Basically, we are a student-led organization based out of Georgia Tech with the goal of empowering rising entrepreneurs and educating them. And we facilitate that mainly through events. So we host a lot of different networking events, workshops centered around a general topic. We have keynote speakers come out and share their advice and their perspective. And through our fellowship program or our membership program, which we'll get into later, we also kind of facilitate mentorship. We're also really lucky to have a bunch of really great partners that we partner with, both within and around Georgia Tech, which we'll also kind of touch base on later. And that's also including student innovation, which is why we're here today. So speaking on today, originally we had the idea of doing kind of a lightning round of information, but as we kind of progressed through that idea, we decided to switch it up a little bit. So we're going to be talking about all the same topics that were advertised for today, which include basic startup concepts, general advice and resources for you guys around Georgia Tech. Except we are going to switch up the format a bit. So we're going to be kind of talking about our perspective in creating what we call a community startup, right? So Startup Exchange for us, we kind of view it as a startup in its own right. So we're going to be sharing a lot of these ideas about startups and about the fundamentals of startups through the perspective of us making our community startup. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of pass it around for people to introduce themselves because we have a panel here today. I'll go ahead with myself. My name is Jacob. I am a rising third-year computer science major, and I'm the director of logistics for Startup Exchange, which means I'm in charge of putting together these events. So I guess we're going to do this kind of a popcorn style. So I'll pass it to Peter. Just your name, year, major, and what you do for Startup Exchange.
Cool. My name is Peter. I'm a rising third year at Tech. I'm a computer science major, and I'm a co-director of Startup Exchange. I've been involved for about 2 years and basically run a little bit of everything. I'll pass it to Praneet.
Hi, everyone. My name is Praneet. I'm a second-year computer science student at Georgia Tech. I recently joined the Startup Exchange executive team this past spring semester. I help with leading partnerships with VCs and just people in the community in general. If you're working on something startup-y, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can schedule a talk. That's what I do for Startup Exchange, and I'll pass it on to Shruti.
Hey everyone, my name is Shruti. I am a rising second year at Tech. I'm a computational media major, and I am the creative director at Startup Exchange, which basically means I do a lot of the graphic design work and run all of our social media. I'll pass it on to Prashik.
Hey guys, my name is Prashik. I'm a third year computer engineering major, and I'm the events director at Startup Exchange. So my job is basically to plan awesome events for y'all and make sure that you guys are able to enjoy the events and learn something from them. I'll pass it on to who's left, Ram?
Hey guys, my name is Ram. I'm a rising second year BME major at Tech, and I work on the logistics and marketing team for Startup Exchange.
All right, thanks guys. So like I said earlier, our usual events aren't really quite like this. We usually have professionals in the field come out and share their perspectives, whether that's a founder of a company sharing, their journey to create that company, or a VC talking about and giving insight into raising capital. This is actually, at least in my tenure at Startup Exchange, the first event where we're the ones doing the speaking. So we tried our best to put together an event that's going to give you guys a little bit of value and something that we can kind of share our perspective on. So we're going to go through kind of the general timeline of creating a startup, which, you have an idea, you go out, you test the idea with customers, you prototype it, and you procure funding. At least that's maybe what one might consider a linear progression for a startup. But I think a lot of people know in reality, it really doesn't work like that. It's kind of all over the place. And every journey for a startup looks a little bit different. So we're going to share a little bit about each of these topics and share what our journey has been like to create our community. So yeah. So we'll start with ideation. So I don't know about you guys on the panel. This is personally my least favorite of all the topics, because it's really hard to convey how to have an idea, right? Some people just have like a good idea. Some people don't have a good idea. But if we were to talk about maybe general things to look for when ideating, obviously it's discovering a problem. I think that's where everyone's head goes first, or looking for maybe a friction point in any sort of interaction. For instance, like a really old one might be even credit cards, getting money out, like paper bills might have been a friction point, and credit cards alleviate that friction. You carry less money with you, and it betters the whole flow of exchange. Another really interesting one that is a little bit less advertised is changing up a business model, right? So, for instance, renting has been a thing for a really long time. Even just renting property for days at a time. But Airbnb kind of interrupted the whole renting world with their new business model, right? So that's some general, I guess, areas to look in when talking about ideation. And we'll get to this in customer discovery, but the best thing to do when you think you have an interesting idea is to ask around and to do customer discovery. And we're going to get into that in a second. Because I think a lot of the really successful startups certainly didn't start out progressing down the avenue they ended up going down, right? I think a lot of times you have an idea, and after you ask around enough, you come to a tangentially related idea that ends up being a lot more successful.
I had something to add real quick for ideation.
Yeah.
So like I was just looking at the networking sheet, and so many of the people here today are all engineering major or some kind of engineer. I'd say like as technical people, we usually fall into the trap where like we find a new technology or interesting technology and then try to build something off of that, right? Like I'm sure a lot of CS majors are interested in like AI or machine learning, right? And so we think about solutions that can use those. But you need to make sure whenever you come up with a startup idea, it's always with the problem in mind first and users in mind first, and not the technology. So think of the problem and then think of the technology that will solve it. So just a little tidbit I wanted to add.
Great. Does anybody else have anything to add on ideation?
Yeah. So can you hear me, Jacob?
Yep.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say, like, Praneeth is absolutely right. A lot of times what happens is people start with the technology first and don't really think of what problem they're solving. So like Praneeth said, it's very important to think about the problem that you're solving and the way that you're solving it rather than how you're solving it. So the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're coming into ideation is, what is the problem that I'm solving? Who am I solving it for? And go from there. How kind of comes when you start answering those questions, and that's how you kind of go through ideation into discovery and whatever comes after that.
And I mean, like, even for ideation, if you look at a lot of great startups, they didn't start out with like the concept that they're going to be a startup, right? Like a simple example is Facebook. Facebook didn't have a business model and plan or anything like that in the beginning. All it was like a platform so that people that met people at their internships over the summer or people for like, well, actually it started as a Harvard's contact list, right? Just to see how students were doing around Harvard. Actually, I think Peter can add something like for Startup Exchange. It didn't really like come up with this idea, or it didn't start with this idea of what it is right now, right? Didn't it start a bit differently?
Startup Exchange, for context, started about 10 years ago now. And it started as essentially a group of friends sitting in a room in the library reading startup books. And that group of friends basically just grew into a little more than that, into an actual community. And we didn't actually start kind of going into growth mode until 2 or 3 years ago, when people realized that this community could be a lot more than just a group of friends, and it was all built around that exact same idea in mind, that Startup Exchange and the community of Startup Exchange is and has always been just a group of people interested in sort of the same thing and interested in innovating and building around ideas. So most startups, I think, do start by accident.
Right. And just to add to all those points, I think there's also a lot to be said about practicing a skill like ideation. I think certainly a lot of startups don't really begin with um, the plan to be a startup in mind. But with anything else, I think the more you try to come up with ideas or see problems in the world around you, the better you're going to get at that. So I would say anytime you think you have an interesting idea, at the very least, I think you should do some maybe internet research on it, or even ask some friends about it, because there's a lot to learn there. The whole process of having an idea and getting some feedback and trying to develop that idea out a little bit. So we're going to move on to customer discovery, which is kind of a big umbrella term for a lot of things. So I'm going to begin by kind of giving the pre-formatted explanation of what customer discovery looks like. Um, so a really useful way to go about it is, with any idea you have, to write out all the basic assumptions for that idea before you do anything else. So for example, let's say I have an app that helps senior citizens track their medication consumption, because that's an issue, right? So my basic assumptions along with that idea is the fact that senior citizens have smartphones, that they know how to use the app store, that they'll use the app, they know how to use the app. So these are all basic assumptions I have to move forward with this idea. And after I do that, then you move forward into kind of asking your perceived audience, which would be seniors in this case, how they feel about these basic assumptions, and how that would work with everything. And it's really important here to not have leading questions. I would say a useful practice to do is to see how long you can ask these people questions without them catching on to like what your idea looks like. So some questions I might ask a senior citizen would be, do you have a smartphone? Do you use apps? Do you know how to access the app store? How many hours a day do you spend on your phone, et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe after I get all those questions out of the way, I can start to ask them how they feel about my specific idea. And couple more important notes to add to that is, I think it is useful to keep track of your customer profiles. So maybe some profiling questions like, how old are you? Like what kind of smartphone do you have? All of these things will give kind of further insight into what your audience is going to look like down the road. And also, you have to be kind of flexible with your questioning when you're in person. So if it looks like your route of questioning is going to go down a specific road, it's really useful to be able to adapt towards that avenue. And something I didn't touch on is the idea of doing this kind of customer discovery in person versus online, which I think is really relevant now, that we're kind of all trapped inside of our homes. So obviously an in-person interview of this type is going to give you more value than an online, at least a spreadsheet, like a survey. So you're going to need anywhere between 60 to 100 in-person interviews in order to really start seeing some useful patterns that you can make some actionable items off of. Whereas you're going to need a lot more surveys, so like non-face-to-face interactions, like 120 to 200 plus, in order to start seeing some patterns in that data. And when you are doing in-person interviews, keep in mind, just like anything else, it really is a skill. So your first 10 to 20 people that you interview, you might even have to throw out that data, not because they're bad, but because you might have not asked the right questions. You might have led them on a little bit too much. There's a lot to learn from being on the asking side of all these questions. Does anybody have any thoughts on customer discovery?
I actually had a interesting experience with customer discovery this past year. So I participated in the Startup Exchange pitch competition my first semester, and our original idea with my group didn't work out because it turned out that that idea already existed, and so my group kind of gave up on even wanting to participate. But I basically sat down in my room and thought, okay, I'm a BME person. What can I do that could, like, what's a quick idea I could come up with that could change or solve some sort of a problem? And so I thought about it and realized that I don't like getting shots. And so I don't like feeling the needle, like, penetrating the skin and then, like, getting the shot. I'd prefer it being numbed. And so I thought through the process. And for customer discovery, since I was in a tight spot in terms of the time frame, I basically ran through the hallways in my dorm, asking random people that were walking through, can you give me some feedback on this idea I have? And there's different ways of getting customer discovery feedback. It's not always just one sort of a way. It's kind of unique for each individual.
Also, adding to Jacob's point before about how, yeah, it is hard to do in-person customer discovery, but don't doubt the power of cold marketing digitally. The number of people on social media now has increased more than ever. So doing cold marketing through there can be very, very powerful for customer discovery.
Customer discovery and customer validation is also one of the most skipped steps. You can skip it and still have like a successful startup, but it also depends on how what your product is at that point. And most people would recommend not to do that.
Yeah, so kind of like not being very specific, but like broadly customer discovery, like Praneeth mentioned, there are two steps: customer discovery and customer validation. And just talking about customer discovery specifically, you are not there to validate what your thought process is, or if you've thought of a problem that you want to solve. You are not going to ask them about, oh, do you have this problem and do you think this solution is going to help? That's not what you're there to do, right? Customer discovery, like they mentioned, needs to be really open-ended, right? When you're going and talking to people, like now you can't do that, but when you still frame questions to ask people, you need to remember that you're initiating conversation about a certain topic and you're listening to what they're talking about and not forcing your idea on them. So it's very important to understand. Let's say, for example, you have trouble finding a parking spot, for example, and you think that, oh, this is such a normal problem. Like, oh, if I drive and I'm going somewhere, I have trouble finding parking lots or parking spots. How is this not solved yet? So then you go around asking people like, hey, do you drive? What are the problems you face when you drive? So you don't necessarily lead with the question like, oh, do you drive and do you have a problem finding parking spots? You're not there to sell your product. You're not there to validate your product. You're there to listen to what their complaints and their pains are. right? So when they tell you like, oh yeah, I drive, but I live in a community where parking lots is assigned to me, or I work in an office where the parking spot is, reserved for me, so I don't really have, and I don't really go anywhere else, so that's not a big problem for me. But they might point out something else in that whole process that's actually a bigger pain than you think and that you might have not thought about. So it's very important that during customer discovery, you listen instead of kind of force your ideas on them. And again, I can't emphasize enough, but your questions need to be extremely open-ended. And because sometimes they talk about some problem that you're like, oh my God, I never thought about that. And you might think that, oh, that problem is not being solved. And I think that is a lot better problem to solve. And I can solve it from the skill set I have and, actually have a company going or have some kind of solution for that going. So it's extremely important to do that. So yeah, that's all I had to add to that.
I mean, I have a really different view, I think, of customer discovery than most people because I am entirely technical. And I think of customer discovery as essentially saving engineering time. And I mean, I was part of the founding team at a company called VoiceFlow, and they essentially kind of ignored all those rules and they went in saying, oh, you know what's cool? Voice apps. How do we build voice apps? Oh, let's build them for kids because kids don't really care how good they are. They just want them to be kind of cool. And that's literally how it started. There was no initial 200 interviews or whatever. It was just iterating over and over again until, eventually one time they pivoted and hit something that was better than before. And that kind of just kept going. And the engineering was very heavy because, they didn't do that initial customer discovery portion. But it worked, and it worked maybe even faster than customer discovery would have, just because it was a very engineering heavy team, and we were able to iterate very, very quickly and use that actual data to inform the decisions rather than spending that upfront time. So it also, I think, depends a lot on where your team's skill sets lie, and if you can spin up 10 different prototypes, one after the other, send them out, get retention data, and see what sticks best. Maybe you don't have to spend, months and months doing customer discovery and research. Maybe you can just start testing things. And that's going to be very different depending on your engineering capabilities.
Great. Just adding on to that, what Peter said is absolutely true. And what Jacob mentioned is also true because customer discovery is very heavily based on what your idea is and what your product is. For example, what Peter said, he started this company where they started, the whole aim, the customer base was kids, right? Kids aren't really that opinionated, and adults are. So yeah, they had multiple iterations of the project going through, and that kind of comes into MVP testing and prototyping and custom validation as well, which we're going to be talking in the future. But the only thing is that, I don't know if you could pick it up, but from what Peter said, their different iterations and seeing what sticks is another form of customer discovery, right? You're still trying to figure out what works best and what the customers are best responding to. So it's not necessary that, like they said, that you have to do 300 or 200 interviews, but at the same time, know your product, know the problem that you're solving, know who you're solving it for, and then approach it with an open mind. And customer discovery luckily is a step that, if you're going ahead with an idea and you figure out, this is not going to work, it's very easy for you to pivot then because you haven't invested a lot of time trying to develop the technology or the prototype. So I feel like a lot of people skip it, but it comes in different forms. So focus on customer discovery. It's important.
We can't hear you, Jacob. We can't, no.
Great. So I just saw the message. All right. So the next step in this journey is prototyping. Wait, who said that?
I did.
All right, go ahead. Like,
All right. So prototyping, right? Prototyping is the next stage after you do customer discovery. You now know the problem that users are facing, the product that you need to build to like fix that problem, right? And so you start off with something called an MVP. An MVP is the real bare bones version of your solution. So meaning like whatever features you think are going to be really attractive, you don't put those in there. You put just the core functionalities into the initial solution. And this ideally should take not that much time to build. It's also something that shouldn't look like good. Like it should be shitty in the beginning. It's just there to test to see if whatever you're thinking is going to be a solution actually solves the problem. And so I put like these two pictures. One is of the earliest version of Twitter. If you look at it, it's pretty ugly, but it does what Twitter does today. It lets people just like post their thoughts onto a website. And then the other one's Justin TV, which is now Twitch. And if you didn't know, Justin TV actually just started out as a video stream of this one guy's life whose name was Justin. And that's all that was. So that's how simple it should be initially to just see if the solution works for users. And then after you've tested your MVP, you start building out towards like the first real version of your product. And how this works is that it's again it's a combination of talking to customers, iterating based on their feedback, talking to them again, iterating again. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to build a product that's for users. If the product's really good, it's really technical, really nice in that aspect, it doesn't matter if the users won't use it. And then you maybe get to like version 1, but even after that, you just iterate and talk to users again. Like there's no real stoppage in the process. Oh, we have a question from Archie Chowdhury. So for customer discovery, how would you market yourself and introduce yourself? Sorry, I did come a little late, so I might have missed that. Okay, so do you guys have input on that?
right. So I can talk about the way I did it. So um, I was working on a smart parking slash navigation idea, and we would go around. The aim was to start from the Midtown area and then expand to different places. So we would go around saying, "Hello, I'm so and so. I'm a student at Georgia Tech, and we're doing this research. Can we talk to you for 2 seconds?" Usually, some people are nice to you and they're like, "Yeah, sure, we'll talk to you." And some people are like, "No, I'm busy. I don't want to talk to you." And that happens more often than you think. But you just gotta be patient and try to find the right audience and try to get as many data points as you possibly can. So I think saying that you go to Georgia Tech does open a lot of doors for you. Like nobody would talk to somebody who's just on the street asking random people random questions. But when you say I'm a student at Georgia Tech and I'm part of the research, it gives you a lot of credibility and people would actually stop and listen to you for a minute. So that's the way I approach it. And then I started from Tech Square and went all the way up till Cafe Intermezzo. And within a day, I think we had 50 to 60 interviews with almost 50 to 60 rejections at the same time. So you just got to keep trying, be patient, and hydrate yourself when you're doing that. So that's my advice.
I also do think being at Tech, you're in like a unique environment where you have people of your age that are there, also adults that are like, young adults and not really old, I guess. And then you also have really old people. So you have each demographic that you can ask as well. And so it's not like Prashik said, just saying you're a Georgia Tech student carries a lot of weight. And so I would say to use that to your advantage. And also, like Prashik said, a lot of people are just going to say no, and that's fine because you're like, at the end of the day, it just matters about how much data you can collect, right? So you just got to deal with that. Oh, sorry. I mispronounced his name. It's Prashik, not Prashik. So I guess this slide covers how we do customer discovery and prototyping at Startup Exchange. We treat each event as an iteration, right? And so after this event, you're going to get a feedback form. Please fill it out so that we can iterate. We actually look at each feedback form and try to modify future events according to that. Peter is our data guru, and I guess like he can talk about some metrics that he tracks and how we improve based on that.
By data guru, he means I take the Eventbrite exports and dump them into a spreadsheet. I actually, yeah, Excel can be hard when you're actually trying to use it right, which has surprised me because I always kind of made fun of people for saying they know Excel, but it's not fun. But yeah, generally we do track audience retention, attrition between events and for individual events, and then how effective our marketing efforts are. So one thing that we're really trying to improve now is essentially our audience stickiness, which is the number of events that specific people will stick around for, basically. And we are seeing essentially big drop-offs after 1 and 2 events. But as soon as we get people who get to 3 or 4 events, they essentially become what we call sticky, and we can rely on them to come to at least a handful of events every single semester throughout their customer lifetime, which would be their time at Tech. And that's something that is pretty analogous to what a SaaS company, for example, would do, is checking their audience retention based on cohorts that are either weekly, monthly, quarterly, and whatnot, and seeing how that audience sticks between cohorts, and basically what changes increase their retention. For us, it turns out to be more community and networking driven events that give us higher retention rates compared to much bigger speaker events, which we could attract 100, 150 people to, but out of those people, there's actually a lower stickiness than we would get at a much more tight-knit community or networking-based event.
I mean, in some sense, this event's also an iteration for us because we've never done like a student panel or a Startup Exchange student panel event. So based on the data that we get here, we'll move forward with whether we do events like these again or we don't. So. All right. So
okay.
No, you go ahead.
I don't want to. As Startup Exchange, we did try to make this as analogous as we could to an actual company, a startup. So our products, so to speak, are A, our events, B, our membership program, and then C, our fellowship program. The fellowship is actually something that we are starting either next semester or spring semester, and it was born out of a bunch of iterations of what our attendees actually wanted to see. So as we mentioned, we actually do send out a lot of feedback, different kinds of feedback forms, get as much data as we can from our attendees, and that initial funnel, I guess, and we do kind of think of it as a sales funnel. So the top of that funnel is our, high-level general events, which is where we get our first touch point with any attendees. And that's anything from networking events, workshops events, big speaker events, and the big speaker events are typically where we have our first touch point. And then those members we are able to usually convert into our community as a whole. So we get another touch point either via email or a group chat, or we're starting up a community Slack team. And from there, we noticed that those community members did want a more focused program almost. And that's where this fellowship program was born out of, was the need for an actual curriculum for entry-level startups, which Praneet is actually working on. So I'll let him give you a little bit of an overview of what that's looking like right now.
Yeah, so we actually like kind of planned out some of it yesterday. How it's looking like right now is that it won't be like a rigid curriculum-based approach. We're gonna have a curriculum that facilitates building. So if you're working on something, if you have a fleshed out idea, we encourage you to apply. And we'll be supplementing with like workshops, mentorship that we provide, um, and possibly funding. So if you have an idea that needs some capital to get off the ground, we're looking into ways to bring that to you. The whole focus of this fellowship is to facilitate building while also building community, right? So if you look at a lot of successful incubators and accelerators, some of those companies that come out of those programs don't go on to be successful, but because of the community that they had in those programs, they go back and like they either work for a startup that came out of there or they'd even invest in somebody that started a startup during that program. And so that's what we're trying to build at Georgia Tech through this fellowship program.
I guess I can speak to this as well. Looks like Jacob's kind of struggling with his audio. But in general, for funding, it can be a tricky topic. A lot of companies or student startups, at least, that we see come to us and basically say, "Hey, we're looking to raise a round of 100 grand or $1 million or whatever it is," and they usually what the reasoning is behind that is usually, oh, we need to actually build it. We have an idea and we need money to build it. And on the West Coast, that may work sometimes, and you might actually raise money off of a good idea and good customer discovery and whatnot. But typically, what we've seen, I think, in this environment, specifically, in the Southeast and around this Atlanta area, is that there needs to be a little more progress. It can't just be, it's not as diluted. The pool of investment is not as diluted as it is in California, for example. And it is a lot more typical that you won't get funding until you do have a prototype. So you will need a technical founder. And I think what was said earlier is that a lot of people in the audience are technical, so that's good for that specifically. But that's where the kind of customer validation and stuff comes in as well, is that, as I mentioned, it's very important to consider the physical location of where you're looking for investment, because again and again, we hear from angel investors and whatnot in Atlanta that they need to see a lot more progress. They need to see the customer data and the prototype, the MVP, and essentially they need to see a lot more progress than you would if you were at, and this is, we may be biased just from what we hear coming out of there versus what we see here, but from what we see coming out of Stanford, for example, is that you can have an idea and a little bit of validation and you can go raise a round on $1 million valuation. Whereas here it is a little bit more difficult in that valuations are a lot more reasonable. Investors are definitely more reasonable, and they're not just dishing out money left and right. And you are going to have to come in with a little more progress and validation before you want funding, which is why I think we do focus on bootstrapping a lot heavier and building up a founding team that'll actually get you from 0 to 1, and then you can kind of go from there once you get to that 1, and don't rely on funding right away is what I've seen, at least in this ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Bay Area, people just like throw around money. Like they see a Stanford student come up with some kind of plausible idea that could turn into something successful, and they give them like $1 million right there on the spot. Um, in Atlanta, I agree with Peter. I think it's like a lot more conservative with funding, but also just to mention a couple of funding resources, that we have a program or an organization close to Georgia Tech called ATDC. I think it's the Advanced Technology Development Center. And if you have, maybe like a MVP or some kind of prototype that you can show, you can discuss with them for some kind of seed funding or pre-seed funding, in a form of a grant, right? And also, I think there's another organization that funds small business innovative research, I think. So like if you're still not at the scale of being like, you know, going out there and hiring, if you're prior to that stage, you can also apply for funding through them. So there are ways to get funding, but it won't be through VCs. At least in Atlanta. That's what I've seen early on. Ram, you want to talk about team?
Yeah, sure. So basically, you need to find people who want to work and not just because you may have like friends or something that are interested, you need to make sure that whoever you're bringing onto the team is willing to put in the work necessary to get the product to completion. Um, and sometimes it doesn't mean like the best working team because you need people that you can get along with as well. So sometimes the like brightest minds or the people with the most technical skills aren't necessarily the best people to work with because you need to make sure that you can all communicate properly and get the job done. Um, and you also need to understand like for in terms of your teammates, you may have a different expectation in terms of prioritizing this project, especially if it's your own idea, and people in your group may consider it less important. And so you need to make it clear to them that this is important to you, and for them to, if this becomes a future startup, for them to also have like a certain percentage of the company, they would also need to, I guess, have the same commitment level that you do. So that's something that I faced like with my startup that I came up with in my first semester. My group was interested through the pitch competition, and then afterwards, the interest kind of died off. And so right now I'm on my own working on it, just over the summer since I have nothing else to do. But as the next semester begins, I'll try looking for a new team of people, even if that means people that I don't necessarily know, people that are willing to help contribute to this idea and are willing to put in the effort necessary. And I think we have a question from Archie Chowdhury. Sorry, no, Ravant. What does the startup scene at GT look like? What resources are there for students to build their startups? Praneet, do you want to speak on that at all?
Um, the student startup scene at Georgia Tech, I think it's bigger than you realize. It just doesn't get enough exposure, so you don't know that it's there. Uh, we actually have somebody in attendance today who's part of CreateX, and CreateX, I think Jacob mentioned it earlier, is like Georgia Tech's student entrepreneurship accelerator. And from last year, I think they had around 250 applicants, or I think it was less than that. And this year they had 500, and I think they ended up accepting around 70 teams. And all those 70 teams are pretty established startup companies. Like they've gone past the MVP stage and they're actually building out their products now. Also, if you look at the Inventure Prize, I think you all know Risha because she's like leading your group. So she puts together the Inventure Prize, and there's like a lot of companies that also come to that event as well and present there. So it's pretty big. It's a lot bigger than you'd think it is, just from looking on the outside. With that being said, I would say that if you want to know more about it, you should actually go out and find people that are working on startups and talk to them about how they got into it as well. Resources, yeah, so resources, yes, Startup Exchange. Our whole motto is to empower the Georgia Tech and all Atlanta, entrepreneurship community. That's our job. We help with the network that we have as an organization. We help you with meeting the right people to take your idea where it needs to go. And then CreateX is another big one. They have their education platform and they also have their accelerator. I actually wanted to touch on something that Ram said because I disagreed. So Ram mentioned how this upcoming semester he's willing to work with anybody that's willing to put in the time, but he doesn't know. I think that's a terrible idea. For a startup, you want to work, especially in the early days. Your co-founder should be somebody that you know, they have a relationship with, because then at that point they're not only investing in the idea, they also have a personal investment that they've made into your relationship, right? If you look at a lot of great successful startups, none of them or most of them have not come out of co-founders that met through some networking event. They might have initially met there, but they developed some kind of relationship over a period of time and then decided to go onto that path. And even your first, I'd say your first 5 to 10 team members, and this is not from experience, this is just looking at the data from successful startup companies. The first 5 to 10 should usually be a personal connection or through a referral of somebody that you trust heavily. But I do agree that you need to be able to work with somebody that not only has a talent, but somebody that you can also work with in a social setting. You don't have to be friends with them or anything, but you should be able to work seamlessly with them.
Yeah,
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, sweet. I'm sorry. I don't know why that happened. Sorry, Shruti, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to agree with Praneet. I recently interned at a startup, and just even as an intern, I had to have the conversation with my team, the people I was working with, about how invested I was going to be in the startup and why it was so important. And this is just as an intern, and now I'm interning at State Farm, which is a huge company, and I didn't even have to have a conversation like that. So coming into just working at a startup or working in your startup itself, you have to make sure that everyone's on that same page regardless.
Founders
So
are
unless
hard.
anyone else has something to say about teams, I think we're going to move on to the execution phase. Does anyone have any final thoughts on the team?
I think Peter was trying to say something.
I was just going to say, right now, you really shouldn't force a founder relationship ever. If you have the ability, or even if you don't have the ability, I would say go at it alone. And right now what I'm doing is I'm just working with freelancers and going at it alone because I've had probably a dozen different conversations and there hasn't been a perfect fit for a co-founder. So I haven't wanted to take that step with anyone, because once you take on a co-founder and you say, you are my co-founder, it's like marriage. That's it. You're bound to them for the lifetime of the company. And if that relationship goes sour, and I know I've seen this happen a million times, is as soon as that relationship goes sour or if one person stops putting in the effort, then the startup just starts to die, and you either have to part ways, and that sets you back a ton, or you have to find, you just basically have someone weighing you down. So that initial relationship is so important to get right, and just to foster that initial relationship and make sure you don't make any rash decisions. And I would even say don't go into something with someone just because they're your friend and because you're like, oh, this person's cool, we get along, we'll work together well. So just I would say be very, very cautious about that whole thing.
I just want to mention one last thing before we move on. There is a safeguard to that problem where the other person might not be as invested after you bring them on. I encourage you to look into it. It's called a 1-year cliff 4-year vest, right? So it has to do with like how equity is shared. So basically, the premise is that if you bring on like a co-founder or like a founding team member, they have to work for 1 year before they get any equity in the company, and then that equity is given to them over the course of 4 years of whatever they're supposed to get. So just something to look into and read on more about. All right, let's go.
So I just have one thing to add on to that. So from what Peter and Praneeth said, I think like not just equity, but just to put it in simpler terms, like Peter said, just because you work well with someone in a social setting doesn't mean that they're going to help you run a company, right? Or help you get the goals that you want to achieve. That's two very different things. And from what Praneeth said, like Peter said, it's like a marriage. Not so much, but like don't rush into it is what I'm saying. Because just because you work well with someone doesn't mean that you're gonna work well together in the company. And you when you're starting off, you don't really have a lot of customers. You're just trying to figure out what works best, and just don't start discussing about equity at that very instant because you have no idea how long it's like for some startups that are just growing. They don't really have idea like, oh, how is equity going to be divided? But that's true that if you bring someone on board, just don't share equity with them. Equity basically means like the responsibility, the power that you get as a co-founder or a founder. Just ease into it, figure out how the dynamic is, and like Praneeth also mentioned, that some people just are in on the idea just to get that title or just to get that authority, and then they don't put enough work in. So it's very important that you don't rush into it and like understand how you guys work together and what the roles are before you start dividing equity.
Yeah, I mean, let me just add one more thing. So, like going off what Prashik was saying, or Prashik said at the end, um, startups right now are really sexy. Like it's like a really sexy thing to like be a student, do a startup, make an app that like all your friends use, right? It gives you a lot of clout. And so, I mean, I guess that's like an unfortunate curse that we're like going through. So people are just doing it to do it. So find somebody that's not doing it just to do it. But I will say I do disagree with the marriage thing. I think it is a marriage because if you have a successful startup, you're ideally going to be in it for at least 10 years, right? And that's really optimistic because you need to first last that many number of years, but it'll take at least that much time. So just wanted to put that out there.
All right, so this is kind of our last point to go over, which is execution. So there's certainly a lot of different ways to execute, and we do it a particular way at Startup Exchange. So I think one of the easiest ways to go about execution is to kind of go through like a top-down kind of approach. So starting at your high-level goals. So like that's like really broad terms, maybe even like 5-year plan, 10-year plan kind of things. And then from there, start distilling down more and more. So you go to like more low-level goals. That's probably more month-long goals, month-long plans. And then finally, from that, you try to pull actionable items that you can begin working towards to get to those goals. So that's kind of, if you're familiar with Scrum at all, that's kind of the production of a backlog, if you will. So then it's really important to start prioritizing those goals and the actions that lead to those goals, not only by importance, but also by scope and by timeline. So let's say you have a goal that you want to get done. It's very important feature to your product, but it has a really long scope. Then certainly you want to put that on from your backlog to items that you're currently working on. But I wouldn't recommend taking on 3 items that are all like very large scopes. So maybe like a really one long-term plan that you're working towards, as well as maybe several 2-week-long sprints. And I think that really comes down to choosing a manageable amount of work, both for yourself and for your team. I think it's really important to err on the side of conservatism when it comes to time management, because it's a lot better for you if you underestimate, or it's a lot better if you overestimate the amount of time something will take than it is if you underestimate it, because that's when you start getting late on feature releases and all that kind of stuff. I touched on this a little bit. We kind of use a modified lazy Scrum like work style for Startup Exchange. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a kind of a framework for like agile work. It has a lot to do with like iterative development. I think that's a pretty good way to go about developing something. Just the whole idea of kind of a heuristic approach towards something and like iterating and like going back and looking at what we did and reviewing and planning the next iteration in like 2 or 3 week sprints. I think it's a good way to start working towards those actionable items that we talked about a little bit earlier. Does anyone have anything to add for executing on something?
In the frame of startups, a lot of startups fail because they focus on the wrong things.
Right.
It's been a common thing. If you just like read about startups that fail, you'll see that they like try to go on like a certain feature or a certain like UI fix and then focus on the main problems that they had, and that's what caused them to fail. So
Right. And I think a lot of execution also comes down to like what your team looks like. So depending on what each of your team members can do as far as prioritizing their work, as well as like the size of your team, I think that's a lot of, you really got to keep that centralized as like an important point when it comes to kind of prioritizing your goals as well as starting to execute on those actionable items. We are hitting our kind of 12 o'clock event cutoff point. I would love to open it up to any more questions if the audience has any more questions. And if anyone on the panel has anything else to kind of chime in on, both on execution or also just overall resources around tech, as well as maybe even just general advice for freshmen, we'd love to hear that too. Something along that line that I will pitch in is I know a lot of people for freshmen preach the idea of like, don't be afraid to fail. And that's certainly true. But I think it's even more important to seek out failure. There's a lot to learn, especially even in the startup world. Just having an idea and going out there with it and trying it and failing with it teaches you a lot. So I would recommend, like how we talked about at the very beginning of this, if you have an idea, just go out and start talking to people about it.
Yeah, you can read 100 different startup books and about 100 different startups that succeeded or failed. And you can watch a bunch of YC videos or whatever people like to do instead of actually doing startups. But just try an idea, push it as hard as you can. If it fails, it fails, and you learn something. If it doesn't fail, well, then you got yourself a startup.
I think something else. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, don't be afraid to go at it alone as well. You don't have to wait to build a team or anything. Just try it out.
Something else that I think people should keep in mind is sometimes the most like technically advanced solution that you may have come up with may not be the best solution for that problem. Something that I learned in my like intro BME class this past year was design thinking. And so sometimes even if like your idea may be like super cool with like all the like high tech stuff, sometimes don't be afraid to think like maybe there's a simpler way to do this. An example that we learned in class was with MRIs, they were having trouble like making children be comfortable with the environment like when they're getting an MRI. And so like engineers and stuff were trying to design like better ways of doing it and stuff like that. And then someone came in and just thought, what if we just painted the room as like pirate ships or like a princess castle and stuff like that and made it look like just a more welcoming environment. And that helped bring down like the anxiety level of the children. So don't be afraid to change your idea, even if that means simplifying it.
So thanks everybody for coming out. I think that's kind of all the time we have for today. If you're interested, I also linked a YouTube video to our YouTube channel where we have been uploading some snippets of our past events, so you can kind of get a feel of what our events look like, and the kind of the different types of value that they bring. But that's kind of that's all we've got for right now. So thank you so much for coming out. Make sure to, if you're interested, click that YouTube link, and there's also a feedback form in the chat, and we'd really appreciate it if you can give us your feedback on this event. We can iterate. Right, guys? So yeah, thanks for coming out, everybody.